Hello and welcome to today's program, The Verdict on Korea's Presidential Impeachment Case. Thank you all for joining us. My name is Tom Byrne. I'm the president and CEO of the Korea Society here in New York City. Today's program is a rapid response to the verdict reached by the Republic of Korea's Constitutional Court on former President Yoon Suk Yeol's impeachment by the National Assembly. 4 months ago, President Yoon declared martial law in South Korea, citing threats from anti-state forces and North Korean collaborators. This triggered impeachment. The Constitutional Court ruled unanimously on Friday morning in Seoul to uphold the ruling, which immediately removed Yoon Suk Yeol from office. He is the second sitting president to be removed from office by the Constitutional Court. To help us understand what this decision means for Korea and its relationships, we have invited two expert speakers, and it's my pleasure to introduce them: a journalist and a diplomat who are now and have been on the front lines as these dramatic events have unfolded in Seoul. First, we welcome back our Michelle Lee, who is the Washington Post's Tokyo Bureau Chief, reporting on Japan and the Korean Peninsula. Thanks so much for joining us again, Michelle. Next, we are delighted to welcome Ambassador Philip Goldberg, who served as America's ambassador to Korea from 2022 to 2025. He is now a member of the board of the Korea Society. Thanks for joining us, Phil. Before we jump in, I want to thank the Korea Foundation and our corporate sponsors for making this program possible. Thank you for tuning in virtually to this timely program. We are welcoming your questions live. Please send your questions throughout the program to policy@koreasociety.org. The moderator for today's session is Jonathan Corrado. Jonathan, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Tom, and thanks to everyone joining us and to our speakers. Dramatic turn of events. The Phoenix flag has been lowered at the presidential compound in Yongsan. So let's start by discussing some of the background for today's momentous decision. This was Korea's third presidential impeachment, the longest trial of its kind, and the second time that impeachment was upheld by the Constitutional Court in Korea. This unanimous decision ends 4 months of uncertainty and sets Korea on a path to address pressing challenges, of which there are many. What were the most important dynamics that set the table for today's outcome? Michelle, we'll go first to you.
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me and having this discussion. It was a very historic day. In terms of the dynamics leading up to this, there's just been a lot of leadership vacuum and a limbo here in South Korea. I'm in Seoul, and just a sense of needing for forward momentum for the country to move forward and find a way to kind of bridge this divide that has just been growing and growing since martial law and since the impeachment vote. Politics has gotten even more rancorous than usual. The two sides become even more divided than usual. Tensions had been rising. Lots of protests every single day, getting really extreme, like hunger strikes and people shaving their heads, kind of like the greatest hits of South Korean protesting. And, the public just was looking for an answer, and all of us sort of also needed to know what's next. And now we know that, the anticipation is over. We know we're moving forward to an election. The Democratic Party also is eager to put forward their leading candidate of Lee Jae-myung. The PPP has also, they need to kind of figure out their leading candidate through their primaries and find who's going to actually face Lee one-on-one. And now we're about to have a June election for the snap presidential election. I think also overall, there was this looming question of whether the Constitutional Court is going to find that what President Yoon did was, quote unquote, a grave violation, because we know that the Constitutional Court can find that somebody violated the Constitution, but they could also decide that it doesn't rise to the level of removing them from public office. We saw that with the Roh Moo-hyun impeachment. So the question today was, okay, is the court going to find him guilty, and is it going to find him in grave violation of the Constitution? And now we found out today it was unanimous. It wasn't clear if it was going to be unanimous. If it was a divided vote, I think the public would have been left with sort of a muddled answer. But today the answer was extremely clear.
Thanks so much, Michelle. Very, very helpful context. Ambassador Goldberg, over to you for any thoughts.
Well, I think Michelle hit it exactly right that the protests that were going on, in Korea, protests are a national tradition, even before and this particular event. And they were going on both sides, but it was clear that the majority of people out on the streets and in public opinion favored the decision that was made yesterday by the Constitutional Court. And in that sense, I think it probably is a great relief to the majority of Koreans that the political process will now move forward, that the limbo will end after 60 days. I will say that during this period, the political back and forth got quite tough. The members of the National Assembly, in any event. But when Han Duck-soo returned as acting president, he tried to put a better face on it and called for calm and for respect for the decision. He did so again yesterday. Lee Jae-myung, of course, now respects the decision, but made some pretty tough statements along the way. But again, he'll be no doubt the presidential candidate moving forward. And so it had a big political content, what he was trying to achieve. As for the decision itself, I was particularly impressed by the reasoning by the court, watching the decision, hearing the rationale, both the failure of President Yoon to follow the constitutional provisions for declaring martial law, and then the facts of what he did during that period of martial law that didn't conform with it. And it was a very well-reasoned decision, and I think that's probably why it was 8-0. And the fact that it's 8-0 is probably a good sign for Korea, because it will dampen any attempt to try to argue that this was an unfair and unjust decision. And the only ones I'm hearing at the moment making that case are Yoon's personal lawyers.
Okay, very good. And let's go a little bit further down into the ruling itself. So acting president of the Constitutional Court, Moon Hyung-bae, said, quote, "By declaring martial law in breach of the Constitution and other laws, the defendant brought back the history of abusing state emergency decrees, shocked the people, and caused confusion in society, economy, politics, diplomacy, and all other areas," end quote. Yoon is immediately removed from power, and now he also faces a criminal indictment on top of that. But I want to talk about what the significance is of this ruling for Korean society writ large. And in particular, do you think that this development underscores the strength of Korea's democratic institutions, or does it highlight their vulnerability? Ambassador Goldberg, we'll start with you for this one.
To me, it highlights it underpins the democratic process of South Korea. First, the action taken by the National Assembly in response. I know it was somewhat criticized in one of the opinions by the Constitutional Court Justice Jung when he said that the impeachment provision had been overused and in some respects abused, the way it was brought back for a second vote in the same session using parliamentary tactics. Nonetheless, the fact that the political process worked in terms of the impeachment, the fact that the demonstrations were largely peaceful, with the exception of the court incident that took place during President Yoon's, I believe it was during his criminal trial, and the fact that the Constitutional Court made a very reasoned decision on the basis of constitutional law all speaks very well for the democratic process in Korea. Clearly, Korea has a lot of problems going forward. The election process will be difficult. Relations with the U.S., as we'll discuss later, are problematic at the moment. And so there are lots of questions out there. But I believe that what happened, in essence, was a validation of the democratic process and Korea's standing as a democracy and what's happened since 1988.
Thanks very much. Michelle, so you were in the court today, the only foreign media representative in the court itself. So I'm hoping you could paint a bit of a picture for us of what it was like in the court and then outside as well, lots of protesters and counter protesters and what the mood was.
I was the only foreign media reporter in there today. There were a couple of domestic reporters as pool reporters too. It was a very straightforward proceeding. The judges came in, read the ruling, and left. There were, the court was split into the Yoon side and then the prosecution side, and there were People Power Party lawmakers as well as Democratic Party lawmakers in the first two rows, and they were all frantically taking notes as the president of the Constitutional Court, acting president, was reading the ruling on behalf of the justices. And they were, it was a very silent room other than keyboards typing from us reporters. And when the ruling, it was, kind of you can tell where the direction was going, that they were laying out the case of for removal, but there was still a possibility that they could say at the end, like, however, we don't find any of these grave enough violations, and therefore he won't be, he'll be reinstated. So we're all just kind of waiting. When the ruling actually happened, I heard a couple Democratic Party lawmakers clapping, not like huge applause or anything, but clapping and saying thank you to the justices and saying that it was historic. So it was a very civil experience. There were, no one in the courtroom like yelling or cheering or like angry or anything like that. There were 20 members of the public. It was something like 4,500 to 1 ads for people who entered the raffle to get a seat in the courtroom. The courtroom wasn't full, so I couldn't quite tell which ones were members of the public. But that was a mood inside the courtroom. Outside, we were worried that things might get out of hand. The police were all very much on standby. The legal barricades were huge all around the vicinity of the court. You couldn't get within any close to the court at all. The two camps were separated, the anti-Yoon, pro-Yoon protests. But actually it was only the anti-Yoon protesters who were showing up at the court today. The pro-Yoon folks went to outside the residence and outside the presidential office. They had a celebration ready to go. I heard there was a DJ and an opera singer who were ready to bring the president back to the presidential office, but that was called off after the ruling. But, I did talk to some protesters who were near the court who were wanting to see the president impeached. Some were, incredibly happy, obviously, because that's where they stood on the issue. But I also talked to some people, and one was quoted in my story, who said, the whole experience was a difficult thing for them. I talked to one man who said, it's been the third impeachment. I thought that things would get better after the second one, but we're still very divided. And he was saying, I hope that this is a way for us to move forward, and all of us have to try to move forward and unite after this. So I think there was that sentiment there as well.
Great. Yeah. And when we look at the two different protest camps, of course, very, very different reactions to the news, with the pro-Yoon protesters expressing their dismay. I saw one article say this is no place to raise children anymore, and lingering concerns about the election interference, and then concerns about the threat from North Korea and China. So those kind of issues remain for them, and they come away quite disheartened. Whereas on the anti-Yoon side, there was elation, K-pop songs, anthems, dancing, tears of joy. So could not be more different. And so sort of setting a picture for us to understand just how partisan and divided Korean society remains.
Yeah, and I think especially the election fraud issue is not going away. The court ruling addressed that, but it's only been growing since it started a few months ago. This whole Stop the Steal movement among the far right that has emerged from the conservatives this time around. Those sentiments were already there, but we've seen it all unite together in a concerted movement and a block now, and they're organized. They all know each other, who they are. They have the galvanizing YouTube channels. So I think that movement is an outgrowth of this experience, and I think that's here to stay, and that's what the political scientists are saying as well.
Ambassador Goldberg, any thoughts on this factionalism before we move on to the presidential race dynamics?
Just that Korean politics, Korean society, deeply polarized and will continue to be so. I don't think that this resolves that completely. There is an opportunity here. I do think, though, I have to keep in mind that, again, 57% of the people in the most recent poll I saw were in favor of upholding the impeachment. So there is a majority for this. And as the election process rolls on, I think some of that will be evident as well. But it doesn't solve the underlying problems, either the economic problems that exist, the problems with youth, the problems of a polarized political situation, the real animosity between the two sides. None of that is resolved by this, but the 8-0 decision is important for trying to put some balm on the wound.
Right. And concerns about the court, the Constitutional Court had 8 out of the total 9 justices, and some controversy around an appointment of the 9th, and 2 justices were set to retire by the end of the month. So there was a clock here in more ways than one to kind of get to a resolution before that. And thankfully, there has been a resolution there. Okay, so let's pivot to the presidential race. The clock starts today. 60 days until we get to an election, and that would be June 3rd, the absolute last day when an election can be held. Difficult to tell from the outside here who has the edge. I've seen some trading places. It's like a horse race, very neck and neck. So what do we know right now about the leading candidates, the leading issues, and what the polls can tell us, and maybe what they can't tell us? So Michelle, we'll start with you.
Yeah, so the clock, I believe, actually starts when the prime minister declares the election.
Okay.
And so I mean, it will be early June. June 3rd is the date that has been floated, but either way, it's going to be the 60-day period after the prime minister begins it. The leading candidate at the moment is Democratic Party leader Lee Jae-myung. He is polling at somewhere in the 30s. There are 4, I believe, candidates, mainly 4 in the mix on the PPP side. Seoul Mayor Oh Se-hoon, the former PPP head Han Dong-un, Kim Moon-soo, the labor minister, and Hong Jun-pyo, one of the prominent PPP lawmakers. They're all polling in the single digits at the moment. I'm sure they'll fight it out, and then whoever emerges will go head to head with Lee Jae-myung. I mean, Lee clearly has a lead, and he has a name recognition. He came less than 1% margin to winning the presidency 3 years ago. So he clearly has like widespread recognition. I don't think it's I don't think it's going to be a shoo-in. A lot of the election dynamics in the last time around was formed around who was it was the both Yoon and Lee were such unlikable candidates to the public that it was kind of the election of the unlikables. And a lot of the election was anti-Yoon, picking Lee because they're anti-Yoon, or picking Yoon because they're anti-Lee. That dynamic doesn't exist anymore. So I think this is going to actually test whether Lee has a built-in base that will show up for him without sort of like a counterweight to pose against him. So it'll be a big test for him. We're already seeing Lee what the South Koreans are calling as right-clicking, which is trying to appeal to the center, appeal to the moderates, tamping down some of his like populist economic proposals, tamping down some of his more divisive diplomatic approaches, and his personality a little bit as well, to try to appeal to those independent voters who will be the swing voters and key to winning this election in 2 months. We're going to see who actually emerges on the PPP side. But Lee definitely has a lead over here on the Democratic side. There were a couple other primary candidates in the mix when it seemed like Lee had a chance of being disqualified from the presidency because of his at the time pending court ruling, but he has cleared that hurdle of potentially being disqualified from running in June. So he has been just pretty much off to the races on his own.
Right clicking, is that from Korean culture or is that from, yeah,
Like the mouse, like a right-clicking mouse.
right,
Yeah.
right. Interesting. Good term. Okay. Ambassador Goldberg, over to you for your thoughts.
No, I think that Michelle is correct that Lee Jae-myung has an open field, obviously, in the Democratic Party, and you'll see him announcing his candidacy soon and his leaving his position as chairman of the party. The other side is unclear. The four candidates mentioned, the labor minister polls the highest. I think Lee Jae-myung, at least in the polls that I've seen, is a little higher than the 30s, into the 40s. And he has the distinct advantage at the moment, the momentum, because of the court decision and the mood for a change from the PPP. So the one other aspect to keep in mind, though, there are a few other candidates that are possible. Lee Yoon Suk, the former chairman of the PPP, is probably going to run on his own. That can take a percentage point or two away, maybe, from the conservative candidate. I don't know what is happening with Ahn Cheol-soo, whether he would consider running, but he has great name recognition and was one of those who voted against Yoon in the impeachment decision. So that I'd be curious if there is any indication that he might run. But the real advantage is with the DP. The one point that has also been mentioned in the press and in political circles is that the conservatives have revived a bit during this process. What was initially a huge blow to them in polls, and especially to Yoon and his approval rating, clearly began to turn around. And so the difference between the two parties has narrowed. The DP has gone ahead again by about 10 points in the polls I've seen. But the conservatives have kind of gone home politically. And so it could be a closer race, depending on who the candidate might be. The one who polls the best is Kim Min-soo, the labor minister.
Mm.
Yeah, I think it's also interesting that this time around doesn't seem like a decimation of the Conservative Party like it was after the Park Geun-hye impeachment, in that there has been more time sent in between the impeachment and the removal, and more time for the Conservatives to sort of rebound in the sense that the ambassador just mentioned. And you know, there's still a big sense among political scientists that it will be a change election, but I don't think it's going to be a given just because of the strength of the conservatives and the real disdain on the conservative side for Lee Jae-myung. It's a very much like a rallying cry to try to put up a strong enough candidate who can beat Lee Jae-myung.
One group that acted as unexpected swing voters last time was young men who transitioned from typically voting for the Democratic Party to supporting Yoon and helping to propel him to victory in the last election. Do we see them also playing that sort of role this time around as well? Are they still on the fence? Have their issues been resolved? Does the constitutional ruling, is that going to affect their position on things?
Sure about constitutional rulings' effect on their position, but polls have showed that in the past 2 months or so, young men in their 20s and 30s have been gravitating more toward the Conservative Party. There are people who are newly turning to the conservative side, even since the last presidential election. On the flip side, there have been many young women coming out to support President Yoon's impeachment. I mean, a lot of that has built over the years with the, Me Too and the all the feminist issues that have sort of galvanized them as well. But I do think that the 20s and 30s definitely remain a swing vote. The pollsters, at least, still see it as a swing vote. We're seeing sort of the extreme ends of the younger voters already taking sides, but the demographic at large still remains swingable.
Right. So I want to go back in time to December 3rd, and you were both in Korea at that time. So now, with the benefit of hindsight, can you tell me about your thoughts at that moment on December 3rd when martial law was declared and the ensuing chaos over the next few days? And then looking back at it now, what does it mean? And so, Ambassador Goldberg, we'll start with you.
You were in office on December 3rd.
Yeah, you were in office as U.S. Ambassador at the point, right?
Yes. Well, the reaction on that night was complete surprise, something that came about without any real warning. There had been some rumblings and accusations by the DP and members in the National Assembly that he was considering martial law and to take it seriously, and nobody did. The one perhaps telltale sign with Yoon was that he always spoke very strongly, very stridently about the opposition, about their attempts to block legislation, block his budget, and also about, well, quite frankly, even in public, referring to them as communists and North Korea agents. So, but nobody really took that seriously in terms of what happened. They knew this was part of his political discourse and even his belief, but not that he would act upon it in that way. So there was just that night and in the days after, a bewilderment about why he did this. Because, if you go back to what the Constitutional Court said last night, it didn't seem to make common sense, let alone constitutional law, that what he did was consistent with the Constitution, nor the acts that he undertook to put it in place were consistent with the provisions of the Constitution. Sending troops, trying to prevent the National Assembly members from getting in, talking about the arrests of people with the deputy from NIS, all kinds of actions that he took that he's now being tried for in a criminal matter. So the only thing I would say going back and looking towards the past is, was this taken seriously enough, what he was saying? Clearly, he was frustrated. And he, as I think one of the Constitutional Court justices said yesterday, had reason to be frustrated. He was being blocked, these impeachments, most of which have been overturned by the court. So he was being blocked and frustrated at every turn, but nobody thought this was going to take place. And so, what we were trying to do initially was just to figure out why. And I don't know that we, beyond what has been said and his own statements about the situation with the opposition, we have a good feel for it. This idea of Chinese agents and that whole aspect of his argument, it just doesn't and didn't add up. So it's it really, in the annals of unforced errors, as the court also said yesterday, this was a political decision. It wasn't made in the context of war or the kind of national emergency envisioned under the Constitution for the imposition of martial law. This was done because he was frustrated and couldn't get his program through. He later tried to argue that this was because it was a warning to the opposition, and he just kind of wanted to throw fear into them. But that's not the way it played out that night. So again, that night and in the days that followed, we were trying to make sense of it all. and to try to keep the alliance strong at the same time, and to make sure, and I had meetings in the weeks that followed, to make sure what the chain of command was, especially before the impeachment took place, and during that interim period where it wasn't clear who was necessarily in charge. And it came down to the fact that President Yoon was still in charge until he was impeached. So those were kind of some initial thoughts about what happened then and the days after.
Very, very helpful insights. Thank you so much, Ambassador Goldberg. Michelle, over to you for your reflections on December 3rd, looking back now.
I was in Seoul that night as well. I think my reflection is similar to the ambassadors in that the one key question still remains unanswered, which is why? Why did he do this? And only he knows. We have heard the reasonings that he's told the public. There are many, many, many other theories around it, but we just don't know, and I don't think we'll ever know. Why President Yoon believed this was a thing that needed to happen, and at that time, that day, why it couldn't wait, or why he couldn't wait until the next election. He had 2.5 more years to go. Why it had to be martial law and why it had to be that day, we still don't know. I think we have something close to closure just because of the way the Constitutional Court ruled today and the forcefulness with which it gave its unanimous answer. But I think it still doesn't answer the fundamental question that still lingers for me, because it still doesn't make sense. And I think the other reflection that I've been sitting with is still the strength of the public in South Korea, and the willingness for those people who showed up that night of martial law to defend democracy. It sounds lofty, but at that night, at that moment, that's what moved them. They had no idea this martial law was going to last 6 hours. There were mostly people who had lived through martial law before and saw it being life-threatening experience and willing to put their lives on the line to go. And we see that spirit throughout. It's a very South Korean thing to do, but the protest culture. But I think we've seen the staying power of that. I think the last thing that I'll say is that I still wonder about how the role of impeachment will play in South Korean politics and the view of the South Korean public. I've talked to political scientists who sort of worry that impeachment will now be seen as an answer to presidents that people don't like, or impeachment used as a political tool, which we're already seeing because of the DP. And Constitutional Court has made it very clear none of those are actual grave violations, and they've rejected all of them. But this notion that when there's a president who does something that the lawmakers don't like and they get removed, and there's a court that upholds that decision. In one way, that's absolutely checks and balances. In another way, it's happened twice in less than 10 years, and that starts to sort of desensitize the public toward the tool of impeachment. And I wonder what the lasting effect of that is going to be.
Can I just add, Jonathan, that
Certainly.
An example of what Michelle was just talking about was the impeachment of Han Duck-soo, and about impeachment's overuse and unjustified use, according to the Constitutional Court. That actually damaged Korea, I believe, in its ability to both deal with domestic policy as well as best they could the relationship with the United States during that period. And so there's an example of impeachment's overuse as a political tool rather than being justified for serious constitutional violations.
Very good point.
And there was also a third impeachment that wasn't upheld with No Mu-yeon, right?
Yeah, going back in time.
Yeah.
Right.
They were just about to impeach the acting president, Choi Sang-mo,
Right.
that's been introduced in Parliament. Like
Wow.
they could have voted on it. And then I was trying to I was trying to explain this in a story, just preparing to write a story about it. And how do you explain that there was an acting president who was there in lieu of another acting president who was there in lieu of an impeached president? You know, it becomes almost farcical at that point.
And at that point, it was over the issue of the appointment of the ninth Constitutional Court member, which had already been ruled by the Constitutional Court to not rise to the level of impeachment.
And so, in terms of the dangerous precedent that this might set, when you look at the history of Korean presidents, they tend to poll in their late 40s in their last couple of years of their administration, year 4 and year 5, capped at 1 term, of course, and tend to see a transition during the midterm. So if that trend continues, you could see the opposition having the power in the National Assembly, a groundswell of public support against the president, and all of this pressure to once again pull the trigger on impeachment to overturn with this bitter memory in mind of how their side's president had recently been impeached in recent history. So yeah, very dangerous precedent. I want to turn now to something that you mentioned, Ambassador Goldberg, which is U.S. Korea relations. So under President Yoon's stewardship, right, so he really emphasized the U.S. Korea alliance and relationship and also trilateral coordination with the U.S., Korea, and Japan. And so now there are questions about where the direction for Korea's foreign policy and relationship with the United States is going to go, especially as there's a moment of instability and a moment of flux for them at the moment where they really need a leader at the helm. There is nobody. So Ambassador Goldberg, over to you for your thoughts.
Well, as has been mentioned, the next 60 days, the limbo will continue during the election period. But what will also come out on both sides are statements about the U.S. Korea relationship that will no doubt be noted in Washington. Issues now related to tariffs, the IRA and chips funding, military funding, meaning the SMA, troop levels and their status, because there is definitely a discussion in Washington about troops in the Indo-Pacific being used more to blunt China and more reliance on local forces to deal with North Korea, and issues related to extended deterrence. So those will all come up in the election campaign, I'm sure. And will be noted in Washington. We're at a very difficult moment in relations at the moment, especially after the decision day before yesterday by President Trump to invoke tariffs on South Korea, along with everyone else. I will say there has been discussion in Seoul and elsewhere about not having a president during this period to deal with Washington. You know, the prime minister of Japan, Ishiba, was in Washington, and they had virtually the same tariffs put on them. Right. There was nothing to be gained by that. In some ways, this is going to depend on President Trump's willingness to negotiate the administration's way out of this situation, as opposed to allow for a new president or anyone else on the Korean side to engage in those negotiations. There will be decisions that have to be made by the Koreans for Korean reasons about how to deal with the tariffs and how to respond, and also the domestic policy situation. But those are all issues that are going to, as I say, be brought out during the campaign and watched, I think, closely from Washington. There will be Lee Jae-myung has tried to reposition himself a bit to support the alliance, to support the trilateral with Japan. He hasn't said a lot about North Korea of late, but is trying to, by his support for the alliance, is really saying that it's important to have a stronger position on North Korea. This is all new, and whether that lasts during the campaign and into his presidency is an open question.
Thanks very much. Michelle, any thoughts about U.S. Korea relations at this moment?
Yeah, I mean, Ambassador just covered it very thoroughly. I think the one thing I'll add is just a little bit more on Lee Jae-myung, and just because he is a front runner at the moment, although he hasn't declared yet, but we expect him to. I interviewed Lee Jae-myung about his foreign policy last month, and it was the first foreign policy interview that he did, and he was taking a much more centrist tack, sort of moving away from the more like firebrand type rhetoric that he's used about the alliance and about Japan and about trilateral relations. He wanted to emphasize more that he would cooperate with the U.S. and also support the trilateral cooperation, and he believes that it's the right thing to do. I mean, part of it, I think, is that it's a reflection of where the public stands in South Korea. They, generally, there's generally public support for what President Yoon had done in terms of like strengthening the alliance with the U.S. and strengthening trilateral. And part of that is because the South Korean public is souring on China and is souring on North Korea, especially the younger folks. And I think the other part of it is that Lee Jae-myung is just he's not particularly ideological when it comes to foreign policy. Unlike Moon Jae-in, we know that engagement with North Korea was very much a defining pillar of his foreign policy. Lee Jae-myung is not the same kind of democratic leader. He has not centered his adult career on North Korea as Moon Jae-in had done. He likes to describe himself as a pragmatic foreign policy leader. And, I asked him, I said, you talk about your foreign policy as pragmatic. What is the Lee Jae-myung brand of pragmatism, and how does it differ from what we understand to be generally the Democratic Party's view on foreign policy? And he said, it's actually very consistent with what we believe to be the Democratic Party's foreign policy, which sort of gave me a baseline understanding of where he's coming from. But I think he's sort of an open book here. He is, I believe, going to take pragmatic approaches to depending on the situation. We could see him come out more forcefully on tariffs. We could see him not. So I think that in terms of alliance, President Trump is definitely an unknown figure in terms of like where he's going to go on all those fronts. But I think Lee Jae-myung is also an unknown figure of where he's going to go, and that might be that'll be definitely something to watch and keep a pulse on.
Can I just add, Lee Jae-myung has repositioned himself, or at least positioned himself more towards the center on foreign policy and with regard to the alliance and the trilateral. In some ways, the reaction in Seoul has been towards a more traditional United States position on the issues, meaning that to take a centrist position on the alliance and how to deal with the United States has taken place in the past. And I think we're in a new situation given the Trump presidency. So it may rely less on how they position themselves to try to do that, because the traditional way that South Korea has gone to try to keep relations with the United States strong may not be the way to do it in the next few months and years.
Right. And so much depends on the personal chemistry of whoever emerges as Korea's president and U.S. President Donald Trump. Are they going to be able to get along? Is it going to be an Abe-like style relationship where there just was that personal chemistry or not? And what are the consequences there?
Well, one issue that may actually bring them together if Lee Jae-myung prevails in the election is North Korea. Whether there has been consultation on that, I doubt it at the moment, but in the future, there could be some coincidence of views on that and trying to get something going there.
That's a great setup for our next question. So a lot of our listeners and viewers who are tuning in are wondering about these foreign policy questions. So Jae-bum Kim, JB, and Fred Katayama, thank you very much, everybody, for tuning in. They're curious about inter-Korean relations. They're curious about Korea's relationship with Japan, the trilat, such an important priority for Yoon, where he made progress there. But open question if a DP president would continue that. And then finally, the global pivotal state, GPS, signature foreign policy of Yoon, where he tried to step up with Korea's willingness to assert itself across the world. And we saw it as an example, engagement with NATO, willingness to indirectly support Ukraine. So those types of examples. Do you see a potential pivot, like if there's an Lee Jae-myung presidency, to a Korea that is more of a hedger, more of a less focused on that, or they could do balancing against China by bandwagoning with Japan? That's another possible route that Korea could go, right? If it has some doubts about the credibility of U.S. assurance and commitment to the region. So any thoughts on those foreign policy questions? I know that's a bunch, so just pick whatever is interesting to you.
Well, I think under a Lee Jae-myung presidency, as opposed to a PPP presidency, there would be more caution on those issues you mentioned, Jonathan, such as NATO and Ukraine, dealing with Russia and China. So I think that would be perhaps the bigger difference in his possible election, whereas a PPP traditional conservative presidency in South Korea would be very pro-alliance and try to figure out ways to keep that intact. Not that Lee Jae-myung wouldn't, he will. And the DP supports the alliance, but in a different sense, perhaps. And as I say, we're going into what I think will be a very difficult period. Some of that will depend on a personal relationship. If that can be developed, we don't know. It depends on whether President Trump will agree to negotiate on the tariffs and some of the issues that are important for South Korea. What will happen with the CHIPS Act funding for Korean companies, and it appears that IRA subsidies will go away. These are going to be big hits for Korean companies. So I think that that's sort of a different worldview that will be in place. On North Korea, there may be something there. There may be some willingness on both sides of the Pacific to deal with North Korea in a different way. We'll see.
Michelle.
Yeah, I mean, the global pivotal state type worldview is just not Lee Jae-myung's worldview. He believes in a strong Korea that looks out for South Korea, and not necessarily via alliances or relationships with other countries. I do believe that he recognizes that the mood now is definitely different than the last time a DP president was in power.
Yeah.
Where the public stands on China, North Korea, Japan, all of that has shifted in the past, 4 or 5 years. On Korea, Japan, I do think that could become a flashpoint at some point. He still feels very strongly about territorial issues and about historical issues. And he's talked about that typical like two-track approach with Japan, which at the end of the day is really difficult to do. One gives out usually, and it's usually the historical issues with the DP. But I think the one difference is that Prime Minister Ishiba in Japan, is actually very open to talking about historical issues, and he is different when it comes to that, and he is more willing to talk about Japan's role in the past. And I think Lee Jae-myung will find a different kind of prime minister in him, although there's then the question of actual political stability for the Ishiba government and whether Prime Minister Ishiba will stay around much longer. But that's also, just one puzzle. I think, it also very much depends how the Trump administration starts to talk with South Korea. The issues that the ambassador also mentioned, tariffs, if he tries to renegotiate SMA, which just got renegotiated, troop withdrawal, if all of those come back on the table, then South Korea is going to probably react in some kind. Lee Jae-myung has said that he wants to talk to President Trump about North Korea. He is very concerned about Korea passing in terms of like
Right.
Washington and Pyongyang talking directly and leaving Seoul out of it. So he's very much worried about that. He told me in the interview that he would be willing to nominate President Trump for a Nobel Peace Prize if something happens with North Korea. So he's definitely has something on North Korea on his mind as a potential way to work with the U.S. in a way that could help the peninsula. But we'll see. Like I said, Lee Jae-myung is definitely a much more pragmatic person, less ideological person on this stuff. And I think a lot of it will depend on all the other players and how they react and how the geopolitics move around South Korea rather than him pursuing a specific kind of foreign policy like President Yoon had.
You can see a bit of complementarity or synergy between an Lee Jae-myung presidency wanting and a U.S. Trump administration wanting engagement and some kind of diplomatic progress with North Korea, South Korea trying to pursue enhanced autonomy from its security point of view, and doing a little bit more hedging in that regard. So all of those things, if the U.S. is going to try to pivot, could actually be synergistic and not necessarily conflictual. So that will be an interesting dynamic to track.
Can I add also on
Yes.
North Korea that while we wait for both sides to sort of make a decision on how to move forward, that again, as you said, Jonathan, there is something there to I think bring both sides together if the administration in Washington is willing to discuss this and bring it out and have a real discussion with Seoul.
I think the other question there is whether North Korea wants to engage in the way it did in
Right.
2018 and 19. We're all
Yeah.
assuming that if South Korea and Washington gets together on this, it'll work out. But the third player here, a very important player, is Kim Jong-un, and the situation has changed a lot with him too.
Yep. Very good point. And perhaps the only thing that could change that would be an end to the war in Russia versus Ukraine, because that would suddenly dry up the need for support, Russian need for North Korean support, and then put Kim Jong-un in a position where, once again, he's only got China to lean on, and so he's looking for that second player to play off against. So that would be a situation in which the geopolitics would once again push Pyongyang towards normalization with Washington. But without that, it's hard to see the incentive. They don't need the sanctions as much as they did, sanctions relief as much as they did in the past. They're not so desperate for normalization any longer as like they were over the past 3 decades, sort of a new era for North Korea's foreign policy priorities. Let's turn to Bonnie O, retired from Georgetown University's question. She asks, what damages have already been done for not having the chief executive of the country? So just the fact that there's been this absence for this amount of time, and as Michelle, you alluded to earlier, then Han Duck-soo was then impeached, so you had an acting president, right? So what are there any long-term impacts here? We kind of discussed a little bit about the tariffs, but any other items?
On tariffs, absolutely. I think not having a credibly permanent, democratically elected leader who can go one-on-one with Trump or have, speak on behalf of the country in a forceful way, that has definitely been a very obvious absence at the top. There was another incident recently where there were reports about South Korea being designated a sensitive country by DOE, and there was a ton of confusion around what that meant, whether it was because of South Korean public views and debates on going nuclear, what it actually means, what it means for the alliance, and that was a bit of a chaotic period that went on for days and days in a way that I'm not sure. I don't know if it would have happened if there were a clear executive in charge in South Korea. So we've seen a couple moments of those. And then, just the general perception of South Korea of the political instability and limbo that it had been for 4 months. But I gotta say, in terms of tangible impacts on day-to-day life and administrative governance, it's been hard to actually say exactly how the government is malfunctioning or dysfunctioning as a result. I think part of it is the institutions have held on their own. And part of it is that, Han Duck-soo was a very good acting president while he was there. And then Choi Sang-mok really stood up to the task and did his best to keep it as stable as possible. I think those two leaders really took the helm in as responsible as a way they probably could have. But I took some time trying to actually really dig in to see any sort of administrative failures or, clear dereliction of duty or any day-to-day life being affected. And I can't say that that has much been visible.
Excellent. Tom, over to you.
Yeah, actually, domestically, the National Assembly did something that was pretty remarkable. The U.S. Congress hasn't done in a long time. They passed a reform of the national pension system to extend its solvency for about 9 years. So, at least from my angle, that's a pretty significant achievement in this so-called political vacuum.
And I would add that on the foreign policy front, I cut some slack for the Koreans. I know that the political world in Seoul and the think tank world loves to dwell on the idea that because there's no president, that there was something to be done about tariffs. I think Michelle is right. The implication of the sensitive country issue was more a domestic issue that could have been put to bed earlier. But in the foreign policy area, I'm not sure that having a president would have made any huge difference at the moment. It may in the future going forward if the Trump administration decides it wants to negotiate on tariffs. If not, who are you going to? There's no negotiation. So I don't think that Han Duck-in, the Moti minister, was in Washington. He met with Howard Lutnick, the Commerce Secretary, and the Trade USTR. The views of Korea were put forward, but I don't think any country was successful, with the possible exception of Canada and Mexico, but those had completely different dynamics involved.
Right. Yeah, very good point. Okay, let's transition to healthcare. A bit of a change here. So Alice Tan from Ms. Medi Hospital asks, how will the outcome of the impeachment trial influence the future of healthcare delivery in South Korea? And I guess we could kind of review why this matters. If we recall, there was a prolonged doctor strike in South Korea, and that was a political issue for the Yoon administration to deal with. So do we think that this impeachment resolution and then the subsequent election of a new president is going to lead to a resolution there, or is it more hard-baked into the institutional framework, this problem that led to the doctor strike? And this is a very, very narrow issue. So it's okay if we don't.
Well, no,
really
actually, no. The Moon Jae-in government tried to put some reforms into the medical school system and tried to do something to readjust the specialties of doctors, and then it backed down. The Yoon government, and given President Yoon's personality as well as his hard position, was unwilling to back down, and this has created a huge dislocation in the medical system in Korea. My guess is that a DP government may move back towards the Moon Jae-in position, and although it wants reform, will not be willing or may want to differentiate itself from the Yoon position and try to resolve the current crisis.
Thank you.
Yeah, he
Michelle, any thoughts on
tried
the
to
doctors?
have some he tried to have some conversations on this with the doctors unions before all this happened, before martial law. I imagine he would maintain that similar track in terms of like trying to break the impasse. It just hasn't been a priority in terms of the national policy makers just the past couple of months. But I agree with the ambassador there.
Well, thanks so much. Any final thoughts to bring us on home?
We've covered a lot of ground.
We've covered a lot of ground.
Two people on the front lines.
Michelle, Ambassador Goldberg, final thoughts to bring us on home?
I can reiterate my earlier statement that what happened yesterday, I think, was an affirmation of Korean democracy, of the rule of law. That is something that is hugely important in a democratic society. We'll see how the election period plays out. The fact that there has been no violence associated with the decision as of now, that was not the case with the Park Geun-hye decision. And so I think that the basic message is that rule of law has prevailed, and that now we hopefully will be moving into a new area where polarization will at least be reduced, if not eliminated. And there is a way forward where there is a clearer position from Seoul with regard to domestic issues as well as relations with the U.S.
A hopeful note to end on. Michelle, do you also have
Yeah.
some optimism?
Yeah, I would also like to end on a hopeful note, try to set aside all the pessimism. But I think we have seen democratic institutions hold, and the value of democracy really hold in the past few months. We saw the people rise for the principle of democracy and against a military-led government. We saw lawmakers vote on it, and we now saw the judiciary take its stance on it. But I really believe now it is up to the elected leaders of South Korea to forge a more united path forward. And I would like to think that this could be a reset, even if it ends up being a very, bitter political fight to the campaign through the campaign. I would like to think that this could be a galvanizing moment for leaders to sort of realize the division that has led to this point, especially with the court's ruling, really putting both sides at fault and saying the two sides really need to find ways to work together. I do hope that the message sticks moving forward, and I hope that the elected leaders of South Korea will heed the court's guidance on that.
Thank you so much. We're lucky to have Ambassador Phil Goldberg, Michelle Lee, two top experts with tons of experience, great knowledge, help to bring such elucidating insights for our audience at the Korea Society. So many people thank Peter and Bradley helping to make the production possible, Chelsie helping to do everything to make this program possible, and President Tom Byrne for coming in and supporting us and helping us to do programs like this.
And thanks to Jonathan Corrado, too.
Yeah, thanks to me. We hope that you will consider joining the Korea Society as a member. It's very easy to do so, and we think reasonable, and you get a lot of benefits from it. So please consider that. You could click join at the KoreaSociety.website. We're back next week for another program about Korea politics of the vortex. So Tom, you'll be moderating that one, looking at Gregory Henderson's work from 1968 and how it applies today with Ed Baker and Hwang In-gu. So that's an exciting program. So stay tuned for that. Thanks, everybody. Have a great morning.